as an exhibit, but identified for appellate purposes.
Okay. And what's the number for that?
The flashlight.
No.
Being this is defense
I
property.
think you're on SS, no,
TT.
Oh, okay.
We'd ask that the court play Defense Exhibit TT, which is the flash drive, which contains the videoed deposition of Dr. Spitz. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Wilson, after you hit play, I need you to keep the arrow down there towards, the cursor down towards the bottom, because that is, I'm hoping, going to keep the video clock on, because I need to be able to see that to make my mutings, okay?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, so everybody's ready, we're going to hit play. Carol, I need you to adjust the volume.
He didn't have a mic.
2019. We are located at 23001 Greater Rats, St. Louis, Michigan. We're here in the matter of people of the state of Ohio versus Lindsay Partin. This is, I'm sorry, my name is Steve Brown.
That's my bad.
I'm sorry. Please identify yourself for the record.
Attorney Chris Tagan for the defense.
All right, down.
Attorney Melinda Powers for the defense. Attorney Kelly Hiley for the Butler County Prosecutor's Office, State of Ohio.
The court clerk, please swear her in.
Try your cursor.
Please repeat after me. Solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Will you say your name and spell it, please?
My name is Werner Spitz. Werner. Last name Spitz.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a medical doctor and I'm a forensic pathologist.
Okay. To obtain that station in life, you had to be educated, correct?
Yes.
All right. Where were you educated?
Well, I went to medical school in Switzerland at the University of Geneva School of Medicine. And that was for 4 years. And then I transferred to the Hebrew University Hadassah Medical School in Jerusalem, Israel, and graduated from medical school in 1953.
After medical school, did you move on to a residency program?
I did.
And what were your residency
I
programs?
did a residency at the I did a residency in pathology at the Hebrew University, and I then continued residency in pathology and forensic pathology at what was called the Leopold Greenberg Institute of Legal Medicine. And I worked there for a total of somewhere between 7 and 9 years. And then I immigrated to the United States.
Upon your immigration to the United States, did you do any fellowships or
Yes.
residency programs?
I did a fellowship in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the State of Maryland. I had a grant from the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and I worked there for a total of around 12 years. First I was a fellow, then I was an assistant medical examiner, then I was a deputy chief medical examiner, and then I moved to Michigan to assume the position of chief medical examiner for the county of Wayne in Detroit. I had that position from 1950 1959 to 1961. In 1961, in somewhere around August, I think it was, I moved to West Berlin, Germany, to work at the Institute of Legal Medicine at the West Berlin School of Medicine. The reason I went there was because I had come to the United States on the wrong kind of visa. That is, I did not come here as an immigrant, but as a visitor. And to become an immigrant, I had to leave the country pursuant to American laws for 2 years, and then apply for an immigration visa. So I did that, and after 2 years and 3 months, I came back to Baltimore and worked there for a while until 1972, when I came to Michigan. While I was in Michigan for only a few days, I was offered the position of medical examiner for the county of Macomb, which is the county we are now where I am now giving this deposition. Actually, I was not the medical examiner at that time, but I was appointed by the county of Macomb as their county pathologist. And after a while, when at that time, medical examiner, who was not a pathologist, when that person died, I was asked to be the chief medical examiner for this county as well, the county of Macomb. I held that position until 2004, when I went into the private practice of forensic pathology. That's where I'm now. I'm also associate professor, not associate, I'm full professor of pathology, teaching forensic pathology at Wayne State University School of Medicine. I've testified in all states, including Alaska and Hawaii. I have testified before the U.S. Congress in the matter of the assassination of President Kennedy. I have testified in all level courts, federal courts, state courts, and all level courts.
Let me ask you this. How long have you practiced forensic pathology?
If you include the training, which is 4 years of pathology residency, and then I did 7 years training in pathology, and then 1 year in forensic pathology, and I did a lot more than that, but a total of 65 years.
Okay. And do you hold a medical license from the state of Michigan presently?
I have a license to practice medicine in Michigan, Virginia, the District of Columbia, that is Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Michigan. I said Michigan, I think I did.
You did, yes. Do you currently hold board certifications?
Yes. I'm board certified by the American Board of Pathology in anatomic and forensic pathology.
All right. I think you did.
Those are 2 boards.
Thank you. I think you did offer up the fact that you've testified as an expert before in many courts, correct?
I'm sorry?
You have testified as an expert before in this 65 years of practice?
Yes.
Okay.
Many times.
In Michigan state courts?
Michigan, all states of this union,
Including Ohio?
including many times in Ohio and in courts in Cincinnati.
Okay. And I think think you identified some prominent cases that you've been involved in. So one of those would be that you were asked to testify as an expert pathologist before Congress in the investigation of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
That's correct.
And when did you do that work?
I did that twice. I did that once for the Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, who put together a committee that testified for the Vice President and a number of members that he had that he assembled. Most of those people were other experts, a total of 5, I think it was, and I was a forensic pathologist among them. And lawyers, various lawyers. And then a year later, I was asked by the House of Representatives to testify before them. And that was in 1976.
Did you testify as an expert in California state courts in the civil action between the estates of Nicole Simpson and Mr. Goldman against O.J. Simpson?
I did.
All right. And do you remember when that was? Or not?
No, but it's a good number of years ago.
I understand. Okay. At this time, I'm going to proffer Dr. Spitz as an expert, and I'm going to turn our attention to the case at bar. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the part where Mr. Fagan in the depositions asked for qualification. I don't think we actually specifically addressed this. I want to make sure the record is clear. Mr. Fagan, you are offering him as an expert in the field of
Forensic pathology.
and state have any position or objection to that?
No objection.
I just want to make sure the record was
Thank you.
clean in that regard. All right, Ms. Wilson, you may hit the video again and keep that cursor where it is. Thanks.
You've been hired by the defense as a pathologist, a forensic pathologist, correct?
Yes.
All right. And we paid you a retainer to do your work, correct?
Yes.
All right. And you have in front of you a packet of information that was supplied to you by my office so that you could offer up an opinion.
Yes.
All right. And I'm going to hand you a couple of things. One is Defense Exhibit O that I've supplied a copy to the prosecutor. And take a look at that. And I'm going to ask you to identify that as the report that you've offered in the case.
That is the report that was based on my review and my conversation with you.
All right. And if you could turn to page 2 and look at the bullet pointed items.
Yes.
All right. Can we agree that in your report, the bullet pointed items were the documents that were supplied to you in this case so that you could form opinions?
Yes, this is what I reviewed.
Okay. And I believe that you've identified to the jury that your professional expertise is in forensic pathology?
Yes.
Okay. And did you primarily, in reaching opinions in this case, base your opinions and viewpoints from the work done by the pathologist for the state in this case?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to hand you what is labeled State Exhibit 71. And I'll proffer to you that that is the opinion letter from Dr. Dean, the state's pathologist.
Yes.
Did you review that?
Yes.
And did you rely upon that?
Yes.
Okay. And then I'm going to hand you, okay, I'm going to hand you the autopsy photographs in the case, which go from State 76, which would be State 76, State 79, State 163, State 83, I'm going too fast, State 80, State 74, State 75, State 77, State 78, State 81, State 82, State 161, and 162, State 164, 165, 166, 167, and 168. I'm going to put those photographs in front of you, and if you could just glance through them and tell me whether or not those are photographs that were supplied to you to reach your opinions in this case.
Yes,
So the photographs that have been handed to you, you acknowledge to be the autopsy photographs?
yes,
All right, and you've looked at those,
yes,
and they help with your formation of opinions in this case?
yes,
All right. With respect to the opinions that you're going to offer here today, will they all be held within a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
yes,
All right. And do you understand that to be medically probable?
yes.
Okay. Let's turn to the opinions that you've offered in your report. Turning to the victim's brain in this case, do you have an opinion about an injury for brain swelling?
Do I,
Objection,
Did you, and,
leading,
I'm sorry?
leading.
All right. Did you offer an opinion in this case about the victim's brain?
yes,
All right. Why don't you relate to the jury what your opinions with respect to the victim's brain was, based on your review of the materials and the pathology report and the photographs?
with regards to the,
First, I'd like to identify the injury to the brain.
with regards to the injury to the brain,
Right.
the injury that I saw was, and convinced myself that there was evidence of such, was brain swelling.
All right. With respect to brain swelling, how is that measured in science?
By the weight of the brain,
All right.
and by the looks of the brain also. If a brain that is swollen is flat, not flat, not shiny, but flat, like a flat surface. Because the brain is a big organ in a small place. So it's like you package it in a small package, and you have creases as a result of that. Well, those creases contain fluid in a swollen brain. And when that happens, the surface becomes flat like this piece of glass here on the table.
What is the weight of a healthy 3-year-old brain?
There's a range. It's not a 3-year-old brain, a female brain would be between 1,250 grams to approximately 1,300 grams.
And how were you able to determine that Hannah's brain in this case was swollen with respect to weight?
Hannah's brain was swollen because it weighed somewhat in excess of that. It weighed 1,350 grams.
Was that evidence to you that an injury was swelling to the brain, the weight?
There was some degree of swelling to the brain, not very much, but there was a swollen brain.
Beyond swelling, did you identify any other injuries to Hannah's brain?
I did not.
All right. I'm going to ask you a question about your opinion with respect to force of injuries to Hannah's brain and head. Did you form an opinion about whether or not the degree of force that was applied to Hannah's head in this case, based on your review of the records and the photographs?
It was not a very impressive type of force an amount of force, if you can call it that, was not a very severe one.
Okay. Did you identify any brain bruising?
That there was bruising in the brain?
Yes.
No, I did not.
Okay. Is that important to your determination about force?
Nah. Yes, it is. It is. If the brain is subjected to a severe blow or severe injury, the brain will be swollen more than what I convinced myself occurred in this case. This is not all you're not looking at an injury and the result of the injury on that very day.
Is there a...
Objection.
Okay. Is there a... Is there terminology or a concept in forensic pathology regarding coup and counter-coup?
Yes,
All
that
right.
is a well-recognized and established terminology applied to conditions that occur in the brain.
Will you first explain to the jury what the concept of coup, counter-coup is?
Well, the brain is confined to the skull. That means it's inside the skull. The brain has envelopes around it. One is the arachnoid membrane. One is the dura, the D-U-R-A. That means, in French, that means lots of these of the terminology used with regards to the brain are French, because the French did a lot of experiments on brains at one time. And so the dura is because the word in French is dur for heart, and it is a heart membrane. That is another envelope that lines the skull outside of the brain. And these membranes protect the brain. There's a small amount of fluid around the brain where the brain moves within that fluid.
And how does that explanation of brain anatomy apply to the concept of coup and counter-coup?
Coup in French means impact. Contre-coup is the impact on the opposite side. Because the brain, if the head moves rapidly, the brain, and then is impacted, the brain will move towards the site of impact, and then bounce back and hit the skull on the other side.
In medical science, and focusing on forensic pathology, is coup and counter-coup a phenomenon seen in forceful head injuries?
Yes.
Did you evaluate Hannah's injuries for the presence of coup and counter-coup when evaluating for either mild or severe force in this case?
There was no evidence of coup and contre-coup in this brain.
And again, why was that significant?
Well, because the presence of coup and contre-coup applies to heads where the severity of the impact, or to stay within the terminology, the coup injury is manifested. That means you see evidence of the site of impact based on the presence of coup injury. That would be the site of impact. And then, of course, the brain bounces back to its normal position, but before it does that, it hits the opposite side. Like if an injury occurs to the back of the head, there will be a focus, an area in the back of the head that will have sustained the coup injury. and then the brain bounces back and hits the bone on the opposite side, namely in the front, the forehead area, and in that area will be the controcule.
All right. And again, did you observe that in Hannah's records and autopsy photographs?
No, I did not observe, and I should say to you that as a matter of my own personal experience, and also I know the literature tells you that the contra-coup injury is many times bigger than the actual coup injury. There was neither the coup nor the contra-coup.
Did you, in your review of the records in this case, in the pathology report and the images, did you notice a skull fracture?
No, there was no skull fracture. There was no skull fracture described, and there was no skull fracture that I understand was documented on X-rays.
Does the absence of a skull fracture relate to your opinion about the degree of force?
Well, if there's no fracture, then the force was not sufficient to cause a fracture.
All right.
In the 3-year-old, considering the fragility of the bones of the skull in a 3-year-old, that is meaningful because in order to fracture a skull of a 3-year-old, you will need a substantial force. And so I can eliminate the word substantial because obviously that was not the case.
So you found no brain bruise, correct?
No, I saw no brain bruise.
You saw no coup, counter coup, correct?
That's correct.
All right.
Coup
And
contra coup is bruises.
correct. And there was no skull fractures, correct?
There was no skull fracture.
Based on that, you arrived at your opinion with respect to the degree of force used to Hannah's head, correct?
Yes.
All right. Let's move on to another opinion that's found in your opinion letter with respect to brain swelling and the use of a respirator in this case. Having reviewed the records, did you become aware that Hannah was placed on a respirator during her time of treatment in Children's Hospital?
Yes.
All right. Do you have an opinion about whether or not that had an effect on swelling of the brain?
Yes. In fact, the use of a respirator, whether it's a child or an adult, manifests itself with brain swelling. The phenomenon is called a respirator brain because the child or the adult or the subject is on a respirator. And when that occurs, the brain will the brain will swell somewhat.
All right. Your report indicates that at autopsy, the Hannah's brain weighed 1,350 grams. My question to you is, does the weight of the brain there and the swelling indicated by 1,350 grams, does that indicate the swelling and the weight of the brain from the injury itself?
I would not be able to tell you whether that was the result of swelling incurred as a result of the injury itself or as a result of the fact that the child was on a respirator for several days.
Okay. And while we're on the topic of the respirator, did you become aware whether or not there was subdural hematoma found on Hannah?
Yes.
All right. And there was or wasn't?
There was.
Okay. And do you recollect the amount of blood discovered by Dr. Dean in weight with respect to that subdural hematoma at the autopsy on the 19th or 20th of March?
Yes, it is my understanding based on the autopsy report that the amount of blood that was determined was 40 ml.
Okay. And does that amount, the 40 ml, does that reflect the amount of blood produced by the injury or something else when it is obtained at the autopsy?
I don't know.
Okay. Does the use of the respirator affect, in your opinion, the amount of hematoma recovered by the pathologist at autopsy?
Yes. The amount, the 40 ml of blood that was recovered by the pathologist is that of the subdural hemorrhage. Whether it occurred as a result of the brain swelling that was the result of being on a respirator, or whether it was the result of the original injury, I cannot determine. Or maybe part of it, maybe 20 ml, or maybe 30 ml, or 25 ml, I cannot determine.
Okay. I'm going to put before you two images. State Exhibit 76 and State Exhibit 79. All right. Let's take a look at those, and we're going to talk about those for a second. All right. I'll profit to you that those are autopsy photographs.
Yes.
Let's look at State Exhibit 76 first. And this appears, what is State 76?
This is a photograph of this child's head taken from the back.
Okay. And, yeah. We're going to show it just so the jury knows what picture we're looking at. When you observe that photograph, what are the important points that you want the jury to know with regard to the way that injury is depicted in that photograph?
Well, first of all, I need to point out that the picture is bigger than life.
And what does that mean?
But there's a ruler at the side.
Yes.
You can see the ruler photographed with the head. That means that anything that I want to point out to on this head would have to be analyzed and compared to the ruler to know how big that something that I want to show, how big that item is. This head is more than one-to-one. More than one-to-one means that what I'm pointing out, like I want to tell you that the ear here is such and such number of centimeter or inches in size. But this one will be bigger because of the way the photograph was taken. Maybe the camera was closer. Maybe the object was closer to the camera. There are various ways that this can be achieved. So I'm telling you that when I see this head is bigger on the picture than a 3-year-old head for a little girl.
Okay. So you identified scale as being problematic. What else?
And that would entail that any bruise or other manifestation on this head would also be somewhat bigger, considering this discrepancy between this ruler and the normal ruler.
Yes.
This picture taken of the back of this head after it was deprived of the hair growth on this head. The hair was shaven off. And it shows a central bruise, and it shows more bruising on a larger area below and to some extent to the sides of this, of the back of this head.
Why don't you flip it over and then show it so that the jury can see where your fingers are, if you can.
The I don't have a pen. Okay. The central portion is and it measures approximately maybe a little bit bigger than a dime. For comparison. And then there's a larger area which goes like what I'm showing here. If you look at it close up, if you look at the picture close up, you will see that there's more bruising. The bruising that occurred in the center, the dark area that I pointed out first,
Right.
this area that I'm showing you now,
Yes.
I can see it in the back here because of translucency. So I can see it, I'm pointing it out with the pen. Here is the dark area that is about maybe a little bit bigger than a dime. That area was occurred by contact on a flat surface. And the skull, as we all know, is round in the back, round in other places too, but in the back it's especially round. And that area will make contact to the, make contact where the head will contact if sustained an impact on a flat surface. So if you allow me, shall I show it, or may I show it on a skull?
Yes, that helps to demonstrate, yes.
Okay.
There you go.
This is a real human skull of an adult.
Let me put this back on it. Thank you. I'll get you. Thank you.
If I take this skull and put it such that the back of the head is on the glass here of this table, you will see that the area of contact is very small, considering that the bruise here is much bigger.
Yes.
Why is it much bigger? Because this bled during the time that the child was on the respirator. The blood circulation continued, and where there was damage to blood vessels, anywhere within the skull, outside, inside, or what have you, it's wherever there was a blood vessel that allowed some blood seepage, and there was surgery to the skull, and I would like to show another picture here that shows the surgery.
Let me find one for you.
And that bled and settled by gravity to this area, and that's what you're seeing.
All right.
So, but the size of the impact is completely different to the size of the bruise that I showed you.
Well, before I show you the picture to show the surgery, and again, we're on stage 76. Is there one impact or multiple impacts in the image in stage 76?
There's one impact.
The coloration that you see in stage 76, does it represent the injury from, does it represent, strike that, is it from the injury only, or does it involve the use of gravity and circulation during the period of time that she was at Children's Hospital?
This picture shows the bruise that occurred originally, which is this area here, the darker area. Am I showing it correctly?
Yes?
And also it shows the subsequently occurring bruise, which is that much larger area which goes around here, this area here, for which you have to look close up on the picture to see it.
And what part of that image do you attribute to the injury itself, and what part to gravity, surgery, treatment, and laying on her back?
This is the darker area, the dime size or somewhat larger than dime size area, which is here, is from the injury, from the area of contact, where the skull contacted the flat surface. That can be anything that's flat. The subsequent gravity produced bruising is by seepage into the tissue from blood anywhere else within the skull.
Okay, thank you. You did ask to see a picture from the surgery. I'm going to show you State Exhibit 161. If you take a look at that, and based on the image from State Exhibit 161, does that explain or affect your opinions with respect to the injury to the back of the head on 76?
Well, there is another picture that I had in mind, and I think that is more explicit.
Would that be it?
There's another one too, but this one is okay, but there's another one.
Okay. I'll give you State 165.
This one.
Okay. Show it to the jury, please. All right. And have you shown that image to the jury?
It is
State 165, please go.
It is stapled. The wound is stapled. You can see the staples. This is maybe, don't see the end of it, but it's maybe 5 inches long.
Okay. And how does that relate to the opinions that you've given the jury about the injury to the back of the head and the coloration there?
Well, that was where the surgeons gained entrance into the interior of the head to do their thing that they did surgery. They did a craniotomy in that area. Craniotomy means an opening of the skull and entering inside to deal with what abnormalities they see there.
I told you we were done with 76, and I didn't mean that. So again, turning your attention to State 76, I'm going to proffer to you that there's been medical testimony that the injury and bruise from State 76 has been deemed medically insignificant. Do you disagree or agree with that?
Medically insignificant with regards to what?
The cause of death.
Yeah, there were other
As the
manifestations.
characterization.
The cause of death here was brain swelling. And the brain swelling occurred subsequent to the impact. The brain swelling, or part of the brain swelling, may not have occurred at the time of the impact, and probably didn't occur at that time, but it occurred subsequently. And I said so in my report.
And we'll talk about that in a second.
And there is just not coup, not contre coup, no fracture, no nothing to point the finger at the severity of the impact. In view of the fact that there are other manifestations, such as 12 days between injury and 10 days or 12 days between injury and death. The death here was eventually, I would suspect, not a death other than a termination of turning off the ventilator, the artifactual. It was decided medically with agreement usually. I don't know what happened here, but usually they do that with agreement of the next of kin, that they decide there's no sense in continuing this artificial life that this child is undergoing.
Let's move on. Did you form opinions about timing with respect to the amount of time that would have elapsed from the injury to the onset of symptoms in this case?
No, the onset of symptoms was predictable. After 4 days or so, they decided.
The onset of Hannah's first symptoms of an injury.
Oh, the child had certain clinical symptoms or did not have clinical symptoms. I don't know that anybody knows that for sure exactly what clinical symptoms the child had. The child certainly did not have the same symptoms on the first day or the first hour or the first few minutes. This whole thing did not occur in 2 minutes or in 1 minute. This took time for the brain to swell. The brain doesn't swell instantaneously.
Okay. Can you offer an opinion about the amount of time that would have happened or occurred between the injury and the onset of the first symptoms? Can you do that?
It may be immediate, and it may not be immediate. In this case, I do not believe it was immediate, for the simple reason that the impact does not impress me about being the type of impact where I would have coup and contre-coup and fractures and big subdural and all that. Didn't happen.
Okay. I'm going to proffer you some opinions that I submit have been offered by the state's doctors in this case. I think you just addressed the magnitude or degree of force. And if the state's pathologist had testified as to a significant or a severe force, you would disagree with that for the reasons you've already expressed?
Yes, I would disagree with that.
Did you identify any injury to the brain itself, the brain tissue itself, beyond swelling?
Not beyond swelling, no.
All right. If the pathologist had testified about brainstem injury and hemorrhaging within the brain tissue itself and spinal cord injury, do you have an explanation for that?
With regards to bleeding in certain areas of the brain, it almost is compelling to render the opinion that there are hemorrhages in certain parts of the brain to be expected in case of brain swelling, where the hemorrhage occurs not because of the impact, but because of the brain swelling that ensues eventually. So what I'm telling you is that when certain injury occurs, the brain will have no bruise in those areas that I'm talking about. But it will develop a bruise as a result of the brain swelling several days later. Okay. So much so that the pathologist who ends up doing an autopsy on day 10 or 12 will find a bruise in some areas where there was no bruise initially when the impact was applied.
And that would be because of brain swelling and the continuation of brain swelling, and not because of the injury and the impact from the very start.
That's correct. And in my textbook, I'm talking about that.
find that the brain surgery that Hannah experienced, that it would have some effects on the findings that the pathologist made in this case?
I think so.
And just elaborate.
I think so. It is unfortunately so often, and I've seen so many of children and adults that have undergone surgery after injury and have died. That's what my job is, to determine what people die of. So that's why I'm a pathologist, a forensic pathologist. So where in so many cases comparison is made between what the child shows on admission and then what the child showed when it died and an autopsy was performed. And the two don't jive. They don't correspond to each other. Why not? Because things happened after the individual was in the hospital waiting for organ donation or waiting for whatever reason it's waiting for some other something needed to be found out that wasn't found out before. So at one point there will be new manifestations occur, and now the pathologist is confronted with giving an opinion on something that didn't happen at the time of injury, that occurred subsequently as a complication.
And on that point, if I were to proffer to you that none of the radiologists in the case, the child abuse specialists in this case, the ophthalmologist in this case didn't identify brain stem injury, but the pathologist did, would you have an explanation for that?
Well, I can see, but those hemorrhages, when they are located in those specific areas that I mentioned, and they are not found in those kind of areas, so especially in the pons, PONS. So those hemorrhages are called Duret hemorrhages, D-U-R-E-T. And it's well recognized, well established. All the textbooks will tell you that.
Would the brain swelling cause that kind of hemorrhage?
The brain swelling is an essential part of the development of those kind of bruises.
And in your opinion, based on your review of the records and the images here, the brainstem hemorrhaging that was identified in the pathologist report related to what?
To brain swelling.
To the brain swelling. Did the brain swelling continue from the injury all the way through her treatment from March 8th until her death?
The brain swelling became worse.
When you reviewed the photographs that the pathologist took in this case, did you see a photograph of the brain and a cross-section of the brain?
No.
Was that consequential to you or important to you?
Well, I would have liked to see that. But the brain was... I have not seen a picture of the brain sectioned in the manner in which I normally see it. Why not? I can see why not. Because the brain here became soft after it was put on the ventilator. It is difficult to cut a brain where the individual was on a ventilator and developed a respirator type brain. And it's the additional fluid that accumulates in the brain that renders the brain like that. So it's very difficult. The brain has to be put in formaldehyde to allow it to become firm. Only then you cut the brain. If you cut it immediately, you destroy it.
would a photograph of the cross-sectioning of the brain, would it have been able to show the brain hemorrhage within the brain if it existed?
Well, that's why X-rays are taken. If you take a CT scan or other imaging techniques, you see the hemorrhages. And you see them even if they're minuscule.
And you're aware that the imaging done in this case did not reveal any
I am
hemorrhages
aware of it.
within the brain?
I'm aware of it.
All right. I'm going to put in front of you something I forgot to do at the beginning. This is Defendant's Exhibit M. Is this your CV?
Yes.
All right. True and accurate copy of it?
I'm sorry.
Is it a true and accurate copy of it?
I hope so. I don't read these.
Yeah. We'll take a look and make sure that it's true.
But it is correct. Yes. Originally, I did the first one, and then my secretary will perpetuate it.
And then I'm going to put in front of you what's been labeled Defense Exhibit N, which I'll proffer to you is your list of expert testimonies in various cases. Is
Yes,
that-
but I need to point out to you that with all due respect, we do not have a complete list. For at least a year, I don't know when the last entry was, but it's not complete.
All right, but it mostly represents 64 of your 65 years. See?
No, it doesn't. This is only representative for the federal bench 4 years.
Gotcha. And then, are you the author of a pathology textbook?
I'm author and editor, yes.
All right. And when, do you know the name of it?
Medical legal investigation of death.
And
Do you have the book here?
Yeah.
I saw it. I can always forget the subtitle.
it's heavy.
Yeah, 9 pounds. If weight has something to do with quality, then this is a good book.
And what's the name of the book?
The book's name is Medical Legal Investigation of Death, Guidelines for the Application of Pathology to Crime Investigation.
And when did you write this book?
The first book was written in 1972. Then the second edition came in 1980. The third edition came in 1993. The fourth edition came in 2006. And I hope that 2019 will be the year in which the fifth edition will come out. And that will be submitted to the publisher at the most a month.
Okay. Is that the pathology book used in medical schools for teaching pathology?
It's, yes, it is to teach pathology and to teach forensic pathology especially. And as such, lawyers read it, judges read it, borderline specialties that deal with death and injury, they read it.
And all the opinions that you've expressed here today, they're within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, is that correct?
That's correct.
1 second, I think that might be all I have. That'll conclude our direct examination.
Off the record, time is 2:40. The record time is 2:47.
Doctor, good afternoon.
Good afternoon,
Can
ma'am.
you hear me all right?
Of course.
All right. My name is Kelly Riley. I think I introduced myself to you when I came in, but I represent the state of Ohio and work for the Butler County Prosecutor's Office.
Yes.
Doctor, you indicated, or I believe it was at least testified to in some fashion, that you were paid a retainer
Yes.
to review this case.
Yes.
What was the amount of the retainer?
$4,000.
And does that cover the entirety of the cost of your services, or is there additional?
No, there's additional $3,000 for this deposition.
And if you had actually come to Butler County to testify, what would that have been?
$5,000 per day.
And does that include the cost of travel and travel time, or is that separate?
No, that's separate.
So we're here on a Saturday to come see you, right?
I suppose so, yes.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
you're welcome. Doctor, when were you contacted by defense to review this case?
I believe that was, I received the file and opened it in the beginning of March of this year, of 2019.
Doctor, I believe I received my opinion letter from you on, it's dated March 8th of 2019. Is that accurate? Is that correct?
Well, it was written on March 8th.
And actually, I think I received it on March 11th, but you wrote it on March 8th?
Yeah, I wrote it on March 8th.
Did you feel like you had plenty of time to review the materials to make your determination?
Yes, I received the file several days before.
Oh. Did you make any requests for any additional information or any additional things mentioned within the record?
Not that I remember that you had done that.
All right. So there was nothing that you saw that you thought you needed to see in order to make a determination. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. I did meet with counsel and if there were things I wanted to know, then he would have told me.
All right. Dr. I know you testified you're a medical doctor and also a pathologist and have been doing pathology, you said 65 years, correct?
Yes, yes.
But you are not a radiologist, correct?
No, I'm not.
And you are not an ophthalmologist, correct?
No,
You're not a certified pediatrician?
no.
You're not a certified child abuse pediatrician, correct?
Well, but I do evaluate child abuse cases.
Right, but do you recognize there's actually a board certification for child abuse pediatricians?
Yes, I'm aware of that, and I'm not so sure that that's the same kind of specialty that I do, because after all, I do talk to the police. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know whether they're talking to the police and whether the police is talking to them. I have a very good relationship with all the police departments that I work for, and they give me what I need.
Okay.
And I do autopsies, and then I lecture to the police about what I find. So I don't know if that's the same thing or not.
Well, you would agree that a pediatrician is a treating physician. I'm not saying you don't have any knowledge regarding children, But a pediatrician would be somebody who actually treats and cares for live children, and then once they are deceased, they come to you, correct?
Not all, but those that are suspect, yes.
Okay. So those that are suspected of maybe being abused, or at least a
Yes.
question regarding the death, right?
Yes, yes.
And that's your specialty. You've only ever seen children that are deceased when you see them
No,
in your care?
no, that's not correct.
Okay.
Because I have seen a lot of children, and that includes adults as well, where the police come here and bring me pictures, and they bring me children sometimes. And they say, did this child fall down the stairs? And I look at the child, and I say, no, the child didn't fall down the stairs. Well, how can you say that? Why not? Well, because the injuries don't support that.
All right. And so you're looking externally, you're not looking internally at the child, correct?
I look at the medical records, I look at the photographs from before and the photographs afterwards, and I look at the child. And if they bring me the child after an injury, I can look at the child and have a very capable opinion about what is likely to have caused that injury.
Doctor, you would agree that in addition to reviewing an autopsy or conducting an autopsy and reviewing the records and reviewing those thoroughly, it's also important to review the medical records of the treatment of the child, correct?
Probably, yes.
And especially in a situation where a child was on a respirator for 10 days and essentially artificially kept living, correct?
Yes.
And why is that?
Why is what?
Why is it important to look at those medical records when a child has been kept artificially alive for 10 days on a respirator?
Well, because during the time where the child is on a respirator, things continue to happen. Because blood is still circulating, blood is still settling by gravity, brains swell more if they swelled at the beginning, and other things happen. So maintenance of a child, or an adult for that matter, on a respirator has its own complicating events that occur.
And doctor, isn't it true that even some injuries on a child over that time could heal during that time?
Somewhat, but I mean, we're not talking about a lengthy period of time. We're talking, although, well, 10 days is a lengthy period of time in and of itself, but it's only 10 days.
Doctor, you talked about gravity shifting,
Yes,
and that's something that you're trained to look for as a pathologist, correct? The gravity shifting, I guess you actually didn't testify to gravity shifting. I think you just called it the blood draining down from
By
the
gravity.
surgery. Right, by gravity.
yes.
So how do you determine what is an impact site and what is blood draining by gravity?
Blood that settles by gravity has a limited amount of pressure behind it. The blood pressure is a lot higher. I watched somebody put his hand through.
Doctor, I'm going to stop you.
Object. I'd ask him, he gets to answer the question.
And I would say not responsive.
All right, and we'll let him, then he gets to answer, and then we can have an argument. Go ahead and finish, get done.
It's short. Somebody put his hand through a plate glass and cut his radial artery. The blood spurted, pulsated to was either 12 or 14-foot ceiling. That does not happen with blood that settles by gravity. Blood that settles by gravity settles in a much limited way to as not as intensely perfusing a tissue. So there is a difference in what they look like. That's why the central area here that I pointed out is dark red or dark purple. But the area that I said is about a little bit bigger than a dime size. Whereas the other area, this further down, is much more pale. That is by gravity settling.
All right, and doctor, you said that that initial area is a dime size, and I know you talked about that.
It's a little bit bigger than a dime size on the picture.
States Exhibit 76,
It's the darker area.
the darker area. This is what you're talking about?
I cannot see from here. Yes. And the remainder, the further down, is where when the child is lying, it's lying by the gravity of the head, the weight of the head, makes a little dent in the cushion or pillow, and or the mattress for that matter, so that there is counter pressure to that area, and some of the blood vessels are or some of the tissue is compressed, so therefore the bottom part here on this picture is pale, whereas the area where the bleeding was active as when it occurred is much more pronounced. That's why there's a difference in color.
Well, doctor, with gravity shifting, as a pathologist, you actually have to look for crushed tissue to be able to determine what is actually an impact site and what could be from gravity shifting. Is that correct?
Well, you can, if you want to, cut into the tissue and from the inside, and you can observe there's crushed tissue. Many times tissue is crushed, many times tissue is not crushed very much. The area below that is pale does not have any crushed tissue also.
Well, doctor, in States Exhibit 79, this shows subgaleal hemorrhages, correct? Crushed tissue underneath the scalp, correct?
It shows two areas that have what looks like they may be bruises in the back of the head.
Two separate areas on different planes of the head, correct?
Yes.
All right. And doctor, you said you reviewed the report that was done by Dr. Dean. I believe you have Dr. Dean's report in front of you, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and thank you. States Exhibit 71. And within that report, she also logged the injuries that she saw, correct?
She describes the injuries, yes.
Right. And so she describes several as subgaleal hemorrhages, including an approximately 2-inch diameter purple and red contusion associated with subgaleal hemorrhage in this area. Additionally, there's a vague purple contusion across the midline with an extension to the left occipital aspect of the scalp. This contusion is likewise associated with purple subgaleal hemorrhage.
I'll ask that you give him the exhibit so you can follow it.
It's sitting right in front of him. States Exhibit 71, doctor.
Where?
This is 79.
That's the,
No,
This-
if
oh,
you're
did I
gonna read
take it?
from- if you're gonna read from the report, you gotta give him the report, so you can follow.
Did I did, I'm very sorry. Please exhibit 71.
Yes,
And I'm looking at page 3 of 5.
yes.
And number 4 and number 5
Wait a
on
minute,
those.
this is page 2. I'm looking at page, you want me to look at page 3?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Okay,
So number 4 and number 5, both of those discuss subgaleal hemorrhages, correct?
she describes cutaneous contusions, that means bruises in the scalp.
Keep reading.
And then on the right, occipital aspect of the scalp is an approximately 2-inch in diameter purple and red contusion associated with subgaleal hemorrhage in this area.
All right, and if you want to look at the next sentence.
Additionally, there is a vague purple contusion across the midline with extension to the left occipital aspect of the scalp, covering an approximately 3-inch by 1.5-inch area. This contusion is likewise associated with purple subgaleal hemorrhage.
And then number 5.
On each parieto-occipital aspect of the scalp is an approximately 1-inch in diameter subgaleal hemorrhage.
So that number 4 indicates 2 subgaleal hemorrhages, and number 5 indicates an additional 2 subgaleal hemorrhages, correct?
I suppose that's what this says, yes.
So that would be 4 separate impacts, correct?
No. I don't know that that is so. I don't know that this is actual impact injury. I don't see anything on the surface of the skin. I only see deep subgaleal type injury. I don't know what happened in this area. I can only tell you that there are irregular type bruises, not necessarily associated with an impact.
All right.
Let the record reflect that Dr. Spitz was looking at State Exhibit 79. Sorry to interrupt.
It's all right, thank you. Doctor, you talked about respirator brain,
Yes, ma'am.
and there are specific markers that you look for or conditions that a respirator brain has. You talk about them in your book on page 1017. Do you want to look at it, or do you want to read it? Do you want me to read it? How would
Yeah,
you
go
like
ahead
to
and
do it?
read it.
The respirator brain is soft, swollen, discolored gray-brown with a musty odor due to ischemia and autolysis, correct?
Autolysis, yes. Correct.
So in this case, nowhere in Dr. Dean's report does it indicate that the brain that there was a musty odor, correct?
Okay.
And the brain in this case was not a gray-brown color, correct?
Yes, but the brain was swollen. That's what the main objective of that discussion, because a respirator brain, the primary thing that you see without fail every time you open it, and it's a disgusting appearance, because it probably, I never put down whether it smells or not, but it does. Apparently, yes, obviously the book states it does smell. But did she put it down? No, she didn't put it down. I don't blame her for putting it down, because it's a disgusting thing to read. But it is swollen, and swollen is the issue, because in this case, what is swollen? Swollen is fluid accumulating. That's what makes it swollen, makes it heavy, makes the whole brain look heavy, because the whole brain is swollen. And it's, I don't know about it being brown. It's not really brown, but it's, there's a little tiny bit of blood in it. So that's not surprising that it would be brown or brownish.
All right.
But the main thing is the swelling. That is the main thing about a respiratory brain. And it makes it soft. It makes it so soft that it's almost impossible to cut.
Doctor, is it your contention that there were no slides made of the brain in this case?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if there were, yes.
And if slides were made and parenchymal hemorrhage was identified, that would be indicative of brain injury, correct?
Not necessarily, no. No, because I testified earlier, if you remember, that brain swelling results in the presence of faint hemorrhages and less faint hemorrhages in various areas of the brain, because what the tissue, how it responds to the presence of fluid, is that it moves tissue in various directions, and it almost, when it comes to causing damage, it almost causes tearing of capillaries. Capillary blood vessels are blood vessels that are the size of a red blood cell, and they don't bleed in the full sense of the word, but they ooze some red blood cells. That's what causes the color, that's what causes the appearance of blood.
But realistically, you could have hemorrhages there that are from an actual injury, but you wouldn't be able to distinguish those necessarily between that and because the brain was swollen.
No, I disagree. You don't consider those injuries. You consider those part of brain swelling. And sometimes they look like hemorrhages, but in the ponds they look like hemorrhages. In fact, they're called Durette hemorrhages. That's what they're called. Dr. Durette is the one that first described them in France. And but they're not all dark hemorrhage. There are mostly faint areas on sections of the brain where that has occurred.
Well, and doctor, to be fair, the only way to see that and distinguish between those two would be to look at the slides of the brain, correct?
No, I know what to expect, and I totally understand why she's saying that. I don't need to know that, see it again. Yeah, would have been nice to look at it, but I didn't have the time to study that when I already knew what was going on there, and then the time was of the essence for setting this deposition. I don't mind looking at them at any time in the future, but I don't think it's necessary.
Doctor, you talked about coup and contra coup injury, that you didn't see any of that in the brain of this child,
Yes,
correct?
yes.
And in your book, you talk a lot about the investigation of child death and how to go through that, and you actually wrote that chapter, correct?
Yes, part of it.
And in that, on page 377,
It's shown. I'm gonna hand you, I'm handing the doctor a copy of the 4th edition of Spitz and Fisher's Medicological Investigation of Death. Good?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
yes, go ahead.
all right. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to read it yourself? All
No,
right.
you read it.
Many experts believe that aggressive shaking of an infant can itself cause death. Evidence in support of this opinion includes witness accounts and detailed confessions in which shaking without impact is described. The absence of an impact site is also used to add credence to shaking without impact as the mechanism of injury. However, it is generally accepted that the presence of an impact site partially depends on the nature of the impacting surface. Also, infants typically do not show the characteristic contra-coup contusions that are seen in adults who sustain an occipital scalp impact. Correct?
Yes,
So it's not uncommon that a young brain would not show those coup and contra-coup, correct?
that is correct.
So the fact that there are no coup and contra-coup injuries here, it's not uncommon, and it doesn't mean there wasn't any impact, and it doesn't mean there wasn't any injury, correct?
Well, that is correct. But there are other things too. If there is significant trauma, the skull will respond in kind too. So it's not only that there's no coup and contra-coup, there's no fracture of the skull either. So when you put it all together, the elements of a severe impact and a large subdural, which there was not, because part of that subdural is not due to the injury. Part of that subdural, at least marked, if not a lot more, is of those 40 ml is due to the respirator. So when you put it all together, there is not a justification of calling this a giant impact.
Doctor, to you, what would be a significant amount or significant enough amount of that subdural hemorrhage that you think that the impact could have contributed to that?
I don't know that I can tell you. I would say probably maybe half, but I don't really know. And there's no way of knowing. When I say half, I would say that is based on previous cases where, similar to this case, a child came to the hospital with a trickling of subdural and ended up at autopsy with a much larger type bleeding. So that tells me that there is bleeding during the so-called survival under artificial circumstances. But having said that, in addition to that, there is the evidence that blood vessels that are injured will continue to ooze blood for the duration of the circulation that is still functional, artificially.
Doctor, you testified again, talked about the lack of force and your belief that there was not significant force in this case. And I believe, since you reviewed the images and the report of Dr. Dean, you saw that there were optic nerve sheath hemorrhages?
Yes.
That indicates significant force, correct?
Well, what it indicates is that there was movement of the eye outward of the socket, of the eye socket, either by shaking or by some other mechanism in which this movement occurred. When there's a fall, the brain will be moving rearward, pulling the eyes inward and the optic nerve with it, through the bony canal in the back of the eye socket. You see here in the back of the eye socket is an opening where the optic nerve goes through, in the back of this, where my finger is, on both sides. And when the optic nerve gets pulled rearward or forward through the eye socket, that very delicate optic nerve is going to rub on the bone, causing tiny little capillaries to break and cause hemorrhage. And that is very well documented in a photograph that I saw of the eyes that were photographed after the eye socket was opened. And so does that mean that this was shaken? No. What happened when this statement was made? I don't know really what happened, and
Doctor, I want to go back to this optic nerve sheath hemorrhage. And you just indicated that that can happen by hitting the back of the head, correct? That's your testimony here, that that's what happened?
no, I don't say that. I say that they could have happened as a result of any one of those various mechanisms that could have caused the impact to the back of the head. That could have caused it. Shaking could have caused it, and other mechanisms could have caused it. And when I had a conversation with counsel about the testimony of regarding shaking, I don't object to shaking, but then it has to be a real shaking. It's not the shaking itself that causes it, but the sudden stop. And that was, none of that was, I did not get the impression that that's really what happened here.
Doctor, in your book on page 1111, you indicate, however, hemorrhages within the optic nerve are practically indicative of shaking.
Yes. When shaking occurred.
Are-
That's what happened, that's correct.
Okay.
But when no shaking occurred, there are other mechanisms that will also do it.
Doctor, you talked about being aware of the hemocraniectomy that Hannah received at the hospital,
Yes,
and she received that immediately upon coming into the hospital.
yes.
Are you aware of why she received that?
Because they were trying to see if they can do something about the subdural. If she had a subdural, I don't know what they did. Other than that, I know that they were placing a pressure monitor where they put a tube into the brain to determine pressure. That's what I know happened, but I don't know any more detail about that.
So doctor, you're not sure if there was a subdural? Is that what you're
If that
saying?
subdural was removed,
Okay.
I don't know if it was removed or not.
So you didn't read the surgical notes from that procedure?
I did not read the surgical notes, but that would not surprise me if the opening was made to remove the subdural,
And would it
or to
surprise
remove a
you,
subdural.
would it surprise you to learn that the estimated blood loss from that subdural was 250 milliliters?
Well, that is a lot of blood,
That is a lot of blood.
yes.
And it was actually causing her brain to shift.
Well, if it's 240 ml, that it would cause some degree of pressure, which would cause the brain to shift.
And you looked at the radiology images to see that?
I did look at the radiology images.
Doctor, within that surgical note, within the surgical note by the surgeon from that, he also talks about seeing the brain. Did you note that?
Yes,
And in there, he states that the underlying brain was seen to be significantly injured as it was pale in color throughout the hemisphere and non-pulsatile, which means not marked by pulsation, correct?
well, that is a lot of swelling that you was saying.
And that means there's no blood coming into that area.
Well, when the brain swells, it pushes up against the bone, the skull, and that causes compression of blood vessels. So consequently, the brain does not get enough blood.
And did you note within that record that as the surgeon was evacuating the large subdural bleed, that the underlying swelling in the brain caused the brain to start to herniate out of that defect?
Well, that's to be expected, yes.
And that during that brain surgery, they found one large vein on the cortical surface that bridged to join the superior sagittal sinus, and a second hemorrhage on the smaller cortical vein in the parietal region, and they repaired those within that surgery. Were you aware of that?
Well, those were blood that clotted. I suspect that's what happened from the increased pressure inside the skull from the brain swelling, that the sinuses will be compressed and then the blood in them will clot. And then there is no circulation in those, so no blood circulation in those sinuses. So that's not anything new. That is just part of the process.
Doctor, this is an active bleed. I'm not talking about clotting. I'm talking about an active vein bleeding in the brain, and that's what they found, 2 of those. Do you understand that?
No, I did not understand that.
That would be significant for you to know in your determination of whether or not there was a brain injury, would it?
There was no injury to the brain. That was not described in the report of autopsy.
Doctor, within your book on page 1037, it indicates a 50 milliliter acute subdural hemorrhage almost always causes symptoms, and a 100 milliliter subdural hemorrhage is often fatal. Correct?
Well, I don't know about, that depends on other circumstances too, but a subdural that is 100 ml that is removed may not be fatal, whereas a one that's 100 ml and is removed may be fatal because there are other manifestations as well. But the main element is not the subdural so much as the fact that there's brain swelling.
And doctor, you just indicated that a person who had the subdural hemorrhage may survive when it's removed, but they may not because of other underlying injury, correct?
That's correct.
And in this case, she didn't survive, correct?
She did not survive. No, she didn't. No, don't say that, because she did not
Yes.
survive. I said that too, that earlier. I did say that she did not survive because eventually, after 4 days, it was decided to terminate the artificial survival.
I assume you mean 10 days?
She survived for they turned it off I think 10 days after.
Doctor, those subdural injuries, or those subdural hemorrhages are a diffuse brain injury, correct?
Say that again, please.
A subdural hemorrhage is considered a diffuse brain injury, correct?
Not always. Sometimes it is and sometimes it is not.
Well, you addressed that.
But swelling of the brain is a diffuse injury.
You address that in your book in a number of places.
Yes, I do.
Initially, on page 1022. Do you want to
Yes.
look at it, or you want me to read it to you?
Go ahead and read it.
Diffuse brain injury results in widespread global disruption of brain function, such as confusion, amnesia, or loss of consciousness. These injuries can be produced without an impact, although impacts often complicate these events and augment the forces of acceleration and deceleration. Subdural hematoma is a diffuse brain injury because it can be produced without an impact, and often the removal of the hematoma fails to improve the patient's condition, reflecting the additional diffuse brain injury that accompanies the subdural hemorrhage.
That's correct.
That's that. And on page 1036, it says the majority of acute subdural hemorrhages occur as a result of severe brain injury, correct?
Subdural hemorrhage, yes, occurs as a result of brain injury, yes. Severe, or sometimes the injury is more severe and causes brain swelling of greater severity and sometimes of lesser severity. So it's really the severity of the brain swelling is not what tells you how severe the impact was or the trauma was.
The most common, on that page on 1036, it also says the most common pathophysiological element, which means what caused something, correct? That's what you
Yeah.
call that. In the production of the subdural hemorrhage is sudden acceleration and or deceleration of the skull relative to the brain. This results in stretching and laceration of the veins that bridge the subdural space. Tearing of the bridging blood vessels involves angular or rotational acceleration and deceleration in the sagittal plane, and the veins involved are those entering the superior sagittal sinus.
That's correct.
Doctor, you said that swelling takes time,
Yes.
but swelling actually begins immediately after the injury, correct?
It begins either immediately or not immediately. You cannot, not all cases are the same. And what the differences are, I don't know. There are many people who will tell you that it's unknown that why it is that in some cases the injury will be associated with very quick, very fast swelling, and other times it takes as many as a day or even longer.
Well, doctor, in your book on page 385, which I believe is within the chapter you wrote regarding child death investigation, it states cerebral edema may develop secondary to any significant head injury and is most prominent in a child whose head injuries lead to brain death. Cerebral edema develops within seconds following injury to the brain.
Well, if you read other places, it tells you that it may be immediate and it may not be immediate.
Well, can you?
Well, I would have to look for it. It says here on page 389 that there is such a thing as a likely lucid interval. A lucid interval is the time that it takes between injury and manifest clinical.
Objection, non-responsive.
All right, we're not doing talking objections. Go ahead, finish your point.
So it says here that the likelihood of having a lucid interval depends primarily on the amount of shear injury to the brain and the region of the brain that sustains the injury, in addition to other factors such as the presence of a subdural or epidural hematoma, traumatic axonal injury in the brain stem or spinal cord and brain swelling. So there are different situations which govern how long the lucid interval is. Lucid interval,
Your Honor, sorry.
All right, he gets to finish, and then you can, go ahead, good finish.
lucid interval is another way of saying a period during which there is no brain swelling that's measurable, that's clinically measurable.
But that's a different thing. I asked you specifically about brain swelling, not about lucid interval.
Well, the
Brain
lucid-
swelling occurs because of the injury, correct? The lucid interval is addressing the speed at which the brain is swelling, correct?
Well, that's what you asked me, is how long it takes for the brain swelling to occur.
That is not, you're twisting the question, and I'm going to rephrase it. I'm saying that immediately after injury, the brain begins to swell. I'm not saying the severity and the speed at this point in time. What your book says is that the brain begins to swell.
The brain begins to swell depending on factors. When those factors vary, the brain swelling varies too.
But it's still swelling, correct? If it's
But it
going
may
to
not
swell,
swell for a while. It may swell immediately and it may swell later.
for example, with an epidural hematoma, it may swell later because it doesn't impact the brain immediately, correct?
No, that's not correct. I don't know where you got that from, but the epidural hematoma usually affecting the middle meningeal artery, which is in the temporal region, where the temple is anatomically, and that will probably not make any difference in brain swelling for a significant time, depending on how fast in that particular case the bleeding will occur and exert pressure on the brain. That doesn't occur immediately either. So there are differences in when a certain head injury will manifest brain swelling. No doubt when the brain injury is severe, it occurs sooner than when the brain is subjected to less traumatic damage.
All right, and on page 385, you also indicate that following a severe head injury, I'm sorry, let me start that again. Yes, following a severe head injury, the brain begins to swell. In children, the brain's initial response to trauma is to increase blood flow, correct?
To increase blood flow. Well, that's true of any injury, anywhere.
So immediately after injury to the brain, the blood flow would increase there, correct?
Well, yes, the blood flow will increase, but necessarily brain swelling may not increase in time, in timely relationship to the blood flow.
Doctor, you previously testified in the case of State of Ohio versus Amanda Bacon regarding pupils and the significance of dilated pupils. Can you explain that? What the significance is of dilated pupils in a child with a brain injury?
Dilated pupils occur as a result of damage to the third nerve. The third nerve is the oculomotor nerve, and that nerve governs, causes dilated pupil usually. It can cause other pupillary manifestations.
And that's caused by brain swelling, correct?
That may be caused by brain swelling. Not always is it caused by brain swelling, but it can be caused by brain swelling.
Well, you testified in that case that the size of the pupil in a non-reactive pupil indicates to you that there is brain swelling in progress.
A non-reactive pupil, where it's neither dilated nor constricted, can result from damage to that third nerve and without brain swelling. But it is also possible to occur in brain swelling per se, just brain swelling.
And if the pupils are fixed and dilated, that's indicative of brain swelling, correct?
If the pupils are fixed and dilated, that may indicate advancing brain swelling.
All right, and if, I believe you had both the EMT records, the Fort Hamilton records, and Cincinnati Children's records that you
Yes, I
reviewed
did.
in this case.
Yes.
And with that, they noted a steady change in the pupil response to light, and ultimately, beginning at 7:19, with the EMTs, they noted sluggish reaction. By the time that she got to Fort Hamilton Hospital, 20 to 25 minutes later, her right pupil was blown. And by the time she got to Cincinnati Children's, at 8:57 a.m., both pupils were blown and non-reactive. That would indicate to you the progression of swelling, correct?
That indicates the progression of swelling, but it does not indicate that this was a reaction that occurred at the time of the impact, at the time that this kid was first delivered to the babysitter.
But I think we also talked about that following a severe head injury, or any injury, the body's response is to increase blood flow to the area.
I don't see that that has anything relationship to that.
Well, also within those EMT records, it shows at 7:19 a.m. an increased heart rate and blood pressure, much higher, or very high for a child, and then it's expanded.
Objective characterization.
We heard testimony high for a child at that age, and then began to drop by the time they got to Fort Hamilton Hospital.
But the question to you, to me, was,
So I I'm sorry, this is a new question.
Go ahead and answer.
That what?
This is a new
This
question.
is all at a different time. This is not immediate reaction to an impact that occurred, that caused brain swelling. And my answer to you is that brain swelling can be immediate and it can be delayed by hours and sometimes the whole day.
Doctor, is it my understanding that you did not receive the statements of the defendant in this case?
No, I did not.
The person who the child was in the care of at the time? When the injury manifested and 911 was called?
Well, it is my understanding that the child was delivered to the babysitter by the father, and the father immediately left. That's my understanding.
Okay.
And then he came back when they called him back, and he came back within a very short time.
All right.
That's all.
That's all you know?
That's all I know.
Let me just take a minute. I have no further questions at this time.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Spitz, just so the record's clear, will you elaborate your view and opinions as a forensic pathologist having practiced for 65 years about the relationship between a lucid interval and brain swelling, please?
When brain swelling occurs, the lucid interval gradually disappears. The lucid interval is an interval of time during which there is no clinically diagnosable brain swelling yet. So brain swelling, or the lucid interval for that matter, can occur right away, or it can occur a long time later.
And evaluating whether or not the lucid interval was present and its length, do you look, in your opinion, to the magnitude of force that you see or not?
The magnitude of the force is greater if the lucid interval is faster.
The higher the force, the shorter the interval.
That's correct.
All right. Again here, you did not observe a fracture of the skull.
No, it did not.
You did.
Nobody did.
Okay. You didn't see coup, counter coup.
Nobody did. X-rays taken, don't charge either.
And you saw no bruises in the brain itself.
No bruise in the brain itself.
You're aware that the radiologist in this case did not testify to finding any, in the brain itself, any hemorrhaging
No bruises in the brain itself.
or bleeding or
Well,
hemorrhaging.
well that's it.
Same
Yes,
thing.
that's the same thing.
Right. Are you aware that the child abuse pediatrician did not testify to having looked at images on March the 8th and finding any brain bruises or hemorrhaging?
That's correct.
All right. But the pathologist did.
Yes.
All right.
That's because there was no bruising initially. The bruising that occurred later occurred as a result of brain swelling, when the brain swelling occurred.
And that would apply also to the brainstem hemorrhage?
That applies to all the brain stem as well.
All right.
Brainstem is especially susceptible to later bruising from brain swelling.
I think that's all I have. Thank you very much. And that concludes our deposition. Oh, I'm sorry. No, you need to do. That does not.
Doctor, within your book on page 389, when you talk about lucid intervals,
Yes,
it indicates that head injuries in young children that result from shear forces to the brain causing DAI are generally not associated with a lucid interval, especially if severe neurologic injury or death results. This includes infants and young children who are victims of shaken baby impact syndrome, correct?
that's what it says, yes.
And so shaking a child with impact can cause essentially an immediate result. That's what you're saying within the book.
Yes, I understand that. Because if the child is made to impact a wall or a floor or something very firm, the injury is more severe than just shaking itself. And in that case, you would expect the lucid interval to be, or the brain swelling to occur sooner than later. In this case, I'm unaware of any later indication of brain swelling. I'm only aware that there was an injury that is supposed to have manifested itself within a minute or 2 minutes or some strange time like that. And
Mr. Wilson, we'll need you to play that other second file, please. Well, folks, the second file, not sure.
Are we allowed to stand?
Yes, take you, well, let's see, no, we're back on. Let me just stay seated. Well, you stand up if you want, just pay attention to the video.
Doctor, do you remember your train of thought? Do you want to continue? Doctor, do you remember your train of thought? Do you want to continue, since we had to start a new video?
I think maybe you better ask me the question again.
Well, I think you were explaining why shaken baby with an impact causes more damage.
Yes. Yes, that I remember.
Did you want to elaborate any further?
Well, I can tell you that I think like I already did, that if the child is subjected to a impact to the head against a flat object, and that would result in a severe impact with the expected consequences of injury to the brain, which I do not see in this case. Yet the child was apparently be clinically impaired later on, but not instantaneously. It took time for that to occur here by the time the eyes reacted, by the time the responsiveness of the child became noticeable. The time went by. It was not instantaneous. So that leads me to wonder whether this child was actually intact when it was delivered.
And doctor, if there was testimony that a person shook the child and that preceded an impact, would that cause that kind of severe immediate response?
The impact would have had to have manifested itself in some way, and I fail to see that it did. There's no coup, there's no contre-coup, there's no fracture, there is no, the massive, I call it a massive subdural. If she had 240 or so, 240 or 280 gram subdural, that occurred later. I'm not surprised of that. That occurred a lot later. But at the time, at that limited time of delivery of the child to the babysitter, this was not yet all manifested. None of that was manifested. So the severity of that impact is in question in my mind.
Nothing further.
No redirect.
This concludes the deposition.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes your day. So, we are going to transact some business after you folks leave. I'm going to anticipate, not completely guaranteed, but I anticipate tomorrow at some point you all will receive this case and begin to deliberate. In the meantime, you are still under your admonitions. You are to leave your notepads and your lanyards. You are not to discuss the case. You are not to permit anyone to try to discuss the case with you. You are not to be reading about this on social media, the internet. You're not to be researching any of these issues or any other issues connected to this case. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you a good night. Be here tomorrow. If you can be here around 8:30, I want to get started as close to that 8:30 time as possible. We'll jump into this and hopefully we'll get you to the next stage. Okay? Good night, everyone. Good night, folks.
This might be a dumb question.
Hi, everybody. I'm showing it's 5:30. I'm going to ask your indulgence. I myself could actually use a quick little restroom break. Maybe somebody else could as well. Let's give it about 5 minutes or so. We'll resume. We'll see what the defense next steps are, discuss exhibits, jury instructions, and so forth. Okay?
Thank you, Judge.
Yeah.